So here's what we're going to talk about: 5 ways to maximize your OET speaking points. And these all come from your questions and your comments. Introductions. We're going to start with the 2 different ways to introduce your role play. We're going to talk about forming good questions. There's a few do's and don'ts with that. So things to be aware of with grammar and structure. We're also going to talk through explaining simply exactly what steps to follow. And then much requested was genuine empathy and compassion. So we'll talk about phrases, things the examiner is looking for, not only what you say, but how you say it. And then regular responses. How do you get the patient to talk? And how do you reassure the patient or invite further information? Now, some of you asked about pronunciation, so I will reference that throughout, but on the right side, I have what I call the 3 A's. So the 3 things to remember throughout every single role play that you want to be doing there. And the first one is accuracy. So accuracy with pronunciation and accuracy with grammar. How do you know you're accurate? Well, with pronunciation, if the listener needs you to repeat any words, that's a sign there's some issues with how accurately you're pronouncing it. I'll also talk about a tool at the end. Some of us are probably familiar with it to practice your pronunciation using technology as well. Grammar accuracy, that's a little bit harder to know if you're doing that correctly or not. So I'll show you some examples of accurate grammar, especially with verbs and tenses. So keep that in mind. Everything you say has to be in the right form and in the right way. So that's a big part of what they're looking at with the intelligibility criteria, which is more the pronunciation, as well as the, what was the second one there? I believe the grammatical accuracy, which falls under that appropriateness of language and the resources of grammar and expression. So that's number one. Remember accuracy throughout. Second one is appropriate. And with appropriate, there's a few things there. So appropriate timing. Is your response coming in response to something, or are we just saying phrases throughout? So make sure you're responding to questions or you're reassuring concerns. We want to match what the patient is saying with what our phrases are and our tone. And then adequate. So instead of having one phrase, we want to have a variety of phrases. We're seeing how broad or how many different ways can we show empathy or can we ask questions. And there is a piece of that under the criteria for resources of grammar and expression. So not only is it accurate, but do you know more than one phrase for these skills as well? So I will remind you of these things as we practice: accuracy, appropriate, and adequate in that case. Are there any questions there so far? If so, feel free to put those in the chat, or if you want to use your microphone, you can do so. And we'll go through each of these 5 step by step here. All right. First one, strong introductions. The criteria this is contributing to is the relationship building. So relationship building, how you start the role play, and we'll see empathy also contributes to this. 2 types of scenarios, and this can be confusing. So a review of your 2 scenarios: unfamiliar patient. So we don't know when they last saw us. And here's my example. If you don't know, I saw them a couple weeks ago, a year ago, it's assumed it's just not known. You might say something like this: hello, my name is Dr. Smith, the physician here at the clinic. Can I confirm your name, please? 3 points there. You have a greeting, you have a name / your role, and you're confirming name or using the name. Then your first question for this type of introduction is often finding out the reason for the visit. So what brings you in today? Or tell me the reason for booking your appointment. Often that's the pattern you'll see with those sort of role plays. So that's the unfamiliar patient versus the familiar patient. How do we know they're familiar? Well, we just assessed them or evaluated them. So this would have happened moments before we begin this conversation. How is this different? Well, notice that there's a familiarity in how you're introducing the start of the role play. So instead of starting from the beginning with your who you are, what your role is, get right into greet them, recognizing that context. So hello again, Sarah. I've just finished your assessment and have some results to share with you. Before I do, let me ask you the first question, and you can go right into task number 1. So often these sort of questions are more about how have you been feeling lately, or tell me your recent symptoms. They're getting more into the details right away rather than establishing why they've actually come to see you. Here's a tip that some people are not always aware of, and that is you can actually ask your interlocutor in the exam. You can ask for the patient's name before starting the role play. And so that helps if you're a little bit confused how to start. You can confirm their name with the one you've been given, or you can use their name in this second familiar patient scenario. You can use their name going right in. So are there any questions with that? Keep that in mind when we practice unfamiliar, familiar.
Yeah, Raja, if we, good morning. If we have given an unfamiliar patient and if we ask the name of the interlocutors, then do we need to ask again the introduction?
You don't. Yeah, you can just say something confirming it. So such as it's Sarah, right? Or just to confirm it is Sarah.
Okay.
Something like that. Any other questions there? I see one in the chat. Do they provide name of familiar patient, or we assume the name? Yeah, so they don't give you any names on the role play cards. So instead, what you have to do is either ask beforehand, or there is the option to use any name. You can make up, for example, use my name if I was the patient. You could do that. So that's one of the challenges. You have to have the name somehow going in, either by asking or just by choosing one. Great. Any other questions? All right. In terms of how you're assessed on this, so be careful that you're adapting your introduction for the right type of patient. If you don't show the awareness of the context, the examiner is checking if this is an appropriate introduction. So it will impact your relationship building score if you're not aware of what is my familiarity right now with the patient. Awesome. So that's the first one there. Let's keep going throughout. Question asking. So I had some questions come in before the workshop about grammar. So how do I know my grammar is accurate? And this is a big area that they are checking in your question asking. Are you forming accurate verb choices and tenses? So the first tip I have for you is, one, be careful with your grammar. And first of all, when you're framing your questions, you have to decide, is it present? Is it ongoing? Is it continuing over time, or is it something past and finished? The majority of your questions are actually going to be in the present or in the continuing past to present. So let me just see. I just had a question in the chat about my volume. Can everyone hear me okay? Is the volume loud enough? For the question I got, if you want to try re-entering the meeting, that might help with your speakers if there's an issue there. Thanks for making that comment. All right, let's take a look at a few examples there. So do you have, assuming it's current, present, any stress in your life? So do you have any stress in your life currently? Or are you currently exercising? That's another one we might ask. Versus over time, have you had? So I want to make this point, and I'll write it down just beside, but really make sure if you use did, it has to be something that's finished in the past. So a lot of the time we'll start with the word did, but we're really asking more of a have question. So I'm going to say, be careful with did. Did you have an accident yesterday, sure, that's good. But if I'm asking, have you had over time nausea or pain? That's the appropriate choice for grammar. So be really careful with this. It comes up a lot in terms of mistakes as well. Finally, ongoing. So when you're asking about states, such as your feelings or how you are coping or managing, this is going to often be present perfect, but in the continuous. So how have you been feeling or how have you been coping with this? And the reason for that, it's ongoing, past to present in a continuous manner. So if there's three pieces of grammar to remember, it would be these three. Just make sure you feel confident using the different phrases for that. Do I have any questions about those three grammar constructs there?
Yeah. Rachel, I have a question. If we, in the question number one, if you use currently instead of currently, we use recently, we should use have you had, yes?
Yes. Because the difference there, when you say currently, you mean right in this moment. If you ask recently, you're asking me over the short duration of the past up until now. So maybe as of yesterday to today, and that shifts you back into have you versus did you.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Anything else? Okay. Here's your other grammar tip, and this one's more about the type of question. So start with open questions. 3 ways to do this. Can or could you tell me? Could you tell me more about your symptoms, for example? How is your pain? What is your lifestyle like? So open often comes in the form of one of these 3 sort of either verb choices or the actual question word, how or what. Very often we hear in a role play someone say, do you have pain? Or is your lifestyle good? As a yes, no question. What they want to see instead, start open, broadly, tell me about your lifestyle or what is your lifestyle like? Then move into specifics. What about your exercise? What about your diet? What about your sleep? So keep this in mind. They are checking not only accuracy with grammar, but style of question as you start. If you only used closed questions, that is going to affect that information gathering score. How well are you collecting information from the patient? And they're really focusing on again, the style of those questions. Finally, things to avoid. This will cost you points, and this is also under information gathering criteria. Compound leading questions. Compound with more than one question in each question. So for example, can you tell me more about that part's good, but then adding too much, your diet, exercise, and sleep. The patient is overwhelmed. That's a lot of questions in one. So it's better to say, can you tell me about your lifestyle? First, your diet, and then go into the next question, then your exercise, and then your sleep. So simple is better when you're asking multiple questions at once. It's going to cause confusion and lead to penalties with your information gathering score. Another type, your leading question. So try not to ask negative questions that guide the listener to one or guide the patient to one answer. So you don't have pain, right? The patient might say, well, actually, I do have pain, right? And there's sort of this awkward dynamic. So you want to ask an open question, or can you tell me about your pain? What's your pain like? Rather than assuming that somebody doesn't have it or assuming they do have it as well. So keep these 3 things in mind: grammar, open questions, simple and not leading in one way or the other. Okay, how are we managing with this? Any questions there with those 3 points? All right. When we get to the practice time, I'm going to come and listen to your questions. What are we doing well, and what are we struggling with when it comes to grammar and things like that? Okay, next up, simple explanations. when it's time to give the information to the patient. So maybe you're telling them what results they have, or you're telling them more about their condition and going into those details. An area people often will lose points if they're just reading off their task card. What is the diagnosis? What are the words there? So instead, you want to be really strategic with how you're going to break down each of your steps in your explanation. So first step, they want to see, what does the patient know? And I'm using some pictures here to help us really remember this. So check first what's in their brain, or what did they have in terms of background knowledge. So for example, I put two different scenarios: chickenpox, asthma. Have you heard of chickenpox before? Or what do you know about asthma? This balance between checking before you give, that's a big area as well that's being assessed. So make sure when you get to that part in your role play, you slow down and you think, let me check before I go into my explanation. Awesome. We have some more people joining us. So for anyone just joining us, welcome. This is being recorded just so you are aware, and this will be posted afterwards for your review and also for others who were not able to attend. Okay. Second step of your simple explanations, simplify those medical terms. So you'll see on your role play card vocabulary. And the key thing there is to make sure with that vocabulary that you're being really careful to explain using lay language. So here's some phrases to use. So you're explaining chickenpox, you're going to go, this means what? Or simply put, this is what exactly? Or in other words, this complicated word, what does it mean in the patient words? In terms of how to decide which words do I simplify, the best principle is the more the better. So the more you can show this simplifying and explaining, the more it's that awareness of the patient, and going to also contribute to your information giving score, that sort of careful breakdown of the complex information. All right, the third step. So you've checked what they know, you've simplified what you've told them. And lastly, so following our pictures, transferring that information, ideally you want to check there's no confusion, because sometimes when you're explaining, there will be follow-up questions or things that just weren't quite clear, although you may have thought they were as you were talking. So check in for understanding after you explain. Some examples: are you following me so far? Do you have any questions at this point? Any concerns or anything I can clarify? There's so many different phrases, but what the examiner is looking for is, are you actually doing this after you explain? Is there awareness that the patient may not understand the first time everything that is being said there? So in this approach, to maximize your points, you're going to involve all three of those steps. And very commonly when I'm training individuals, most people remember step 2, giving that information, simplifying a little bit. But a lot of us forget the first step, and certainly that third step, we often, for time pressure, we just sort of keep going. So make sure to take that time with that careful explanation. Okay, so for those of us joining us just now, that's the simple explanations. We've just looked at open questions and grammatically correct questions, and then introductions before that. So this is skill number 3 here. Anything to clarify in terms of how you're approaching this? All right. When we get to practice, I will come and listen as well for how are you approaching that information giving piece when it comes to that task. All right. Much requested from you was, how do we do empathy? So empathy has at least 4 parts. I mean, there's more to talk about, but the reason it's challenging is because first of all, it covers several of the different criteria. So it covers relationship building. Good empathy is going to help that score for relationship building. It also contributes to understanding and incorporating the patient's perspective. when you're responding and when you're trying to understand where they're coming from. So let me break this down into the different aspects here. The first one is have some phrases that you feel comfortable expressing in a genuine way. There's a lot of options here, and you may add more to this list, but very commonly in English, you'll see that we typically will use things like your senses. So I see or I hear. We also use the word sorry, not to apologize, but more to show them that you are, again, you're empathizing with their state. So the word sorry is a fascinating word in English. It's used in so many different ways. And this is actually one of those ways to bridge that gap and to enter the patient's world and to say, I am sorry to hear that. In terms of situations where there are things that are complicated or things that are challenging or frustrating, you can actually comment on that. That must be challenging, or that seems is another word that I don't have there, but it's a good one that I will just pop on my screen. That seems challenging or frustrating. When you get to concerns, you'll notice your patient, depending on the scenario, they might have a lot of concerns, especially a parent-child situation, which we will look at shortly together. With that sort of situation, you want to address the concern and then respond appropriately. So acknowledge that it is a concern. Your concern is valid, or I understand as a parent, that's a natural concern. And then respond to it. What is the direction or what is the advice in response? However, ... or I hear you, I understand, but, or I see where you're coming from. Let's talk more about that. So what the examiner is looking for is that you are showing empathy through those phrases, but there's a second part to it, and these go hand in hand. So make sure tone matches the empathy. So unfortunately, when we're under time pressure, we sometimes remember what to say, but the how we're saying it is not always clear. So when you're saying these phrases, keep your voice a little bit softer. Some people, this helps by slowing down a little bit. So let me read some of these for you just to hear that, as well as the emphasizing which key words. So if I was to say this genuinely, I would say, I'm sorry to hear that. And you can hear that stress on sorry. Or that must be challenging or frustrating. And you can hear that just tone shift a little bit there. Something like, your concern is valid, however, so there's a bit of a tone, intonation going up. Your concern is valid, however, you're kind of leading into the next piece there. That next one, I see where you're coming from. So really emphasize the senses. I see where you're coming from. I hear you. I understand. But, and it's that emphasis that shows that genuineness, not only those phrases. So for some of us, this comes very naturally. For others, there's a little bit of an adjustment there. But with your tone, what you're doing, you're inviting more information. And again, that goes back to another one of the criteria where you are trying to get the patient to share with you those things. I'll just ask, does anyone want to try a little bit of this tone? Or we can do this during practice as well if you like, but any volunteers that want to give tone a try there? Okay, we'll do it later. We'll come back to this in our practice session. There we go. So then some tips. So phrases, tone, and then don't forget, just make sure you're not always using the same phrase. So even if you're natural sounding and it sounds reassuring, if it's the same one every time, it starts to sound a little bit memorized and rehearsed. So use the variety of phrases here. You can introduce other ones as well, but we want to make sure we're not always the same every time. And then timing. Empathy, if it's genuine, it sounds that way and it's at the appropriate time. So after a concern, that's a good place. Usually there's at least a couple of places. I've said at least 2 places in a role play, but there are more than that. You can respond pretty much anytime a patient expresses something confusing or concerning with this as well, and so forth. Okay, empathy is a big one, and I got a lot of questions about that. So in the chat, are there any questions there to follow up with empathy? All right. We will practice with this, and I'll be listening for all of those things: tone, types of phrases, as well as consistency throughout those role plays. All right, this brings us into our last skill, and this actually is similar to empathy, but slightly different. And what this is just responding in general. And it goes with the criteria of gathering information. So you can see question asking, responding, they all are contributing to this criteria of collecting information. I've given you this diagram because from an examiner point of view, an ideal role play looks like this. And a lot of the time, if I was to correct my arrows, a lot of the time when we speak, it's mostly doctor to patient, doctor to patient, doctor to patient. Instead, what they want to see is back and forth. So rather than all in one direction with you talking the whole time, see it as a back and forth as these arrows show. So the patient first tells you their situation or concern. So that's the first step. You respond with empathy. Then they tell you more about their symptoms. And then you give them more information about their diagnosis. And then they ask you about how to manage their condition. And you can see that there's a natural back and forth. And you have to give time and space for the patient to ask you things for this to work. And it's a little bit challenging with time management, but using some phrases like the bottom ones that I will show you can help try to get the patient responding a little bit more. So responses, they can look different depending on what you're trying to convey. Here's some common examples. So when the patient is just giving you, let's say, information about their symptoms, I see, or okay, thanks for sharing that. Something that acknowledges what was said before you respond. And then some of these other ones, I'm glad you came to see me. Acknowledge that. You could also move into that next phrase. Let's talk more about that. So I'm glad you came to see me with your current symptoms. Let's talk more about those together. And then we'll move into some management strategies. This is a great one if you're thinking, I'm talking too much and I really need the patient to give me some more information. Tell me more. You can put this beside anything. Tell me more about, enter whatever it is. So your lifestyle, your diet, your exercise, your children. Tell me more about your children in terms of what the home environment is like. The bonus of this phrase is grammar-wise, it's very simple. It's hard to make a mistake with tell me more about. It's an open question and it invites information. So it covers at least 3 of those skills, all in that phrasing of that question there. Okay, so when we're practicing, keep in mind this back and forth interaction. We really want to promote this dynamic or active conversation rather than you reading, you giving information, and that's it there. All right. Are there any concerns or questions at this point with what we have talked about? Awesome. I'll give a little bit of time in case there is there. Okay, so in summary, we've taken a look at 5 of those skills: introducing appropriately, open questions that are grammatically correct. We talked about simplifying explanations. We talked about empathy, how to show it genuinely. And then this part, remembering to keep the conversation interactive back and forth. So what we're going to do, I am going to end the recording there. And if you're watching this after the workshop, I encourage you to join us next time for some live practice. And for everyone who's here today, I'm going to give us an opportunity to get feedback and to really practice some of these things. So I'm just going to stop the recording there for us.